So maybe I'll take the lead.
Yeah, go for it.
On this one. Like, this was a band that I suggested, and I know like you had heard them and you knew who they were, but never really dove in. So I'll talk about this. This record actually marks the finale of a 3-part series of albums.
Yeah.
About Soupy's childhood and growing up. The other 2 records being The Upsides and Suburbia, I've Given You All and Now I'm Nothing. Now the interesting thing about The Upsides is, I think as far as the Wonder Years are concerned, that's kind of like their official first album, even though they do have, an EP and maybe a full length or something, or maybe some splits that came before that. But they often don't look back on some of that very fondly. In fact, I was having a conversation on our Instagram about that earlier stuff. They are often listed. I want to say, if you look up the term easycore, on Wikipedia, the Wonder Years are often listed in one of the early. So that's why before we were recording tonight, it's like, oh, go listen to this record, because they do have on streaming services, like those older albums aren't available, but they do have a collection of like early stuff on streaming services. I think it's called Sleeping on Trash or whatever. And I said, go listen to some of this, because those first few songs for sure come off of an EP they were still very much, they've even got like the easy core, like keyboard. They've got like the singing and screaming and like all that kind of stuff going on. It's kind of interesting to hear, but they don't look back on it too fondly. The lyrics were also a little more lighthearted, less serious than they would become.
Yeah, I was going to say, I got through 2 songs while I was sitting on the can, and it's like, man, it sounds like they just wrote these based off of just sitting in the van.
And I mean, that's probably what they were doing at the time, right? Like, I mean, they ended up calling that collection of songs, well, I mean, that was off of an EP, but like when they released it later, they called it Sleeping on Trash, because, just talking about probably sleeping on floors, sleeping on wherever, just doing what you can to get by to keep the dream alive. But, so yeah, The Greatest Generation marks the finale of these 3 albums that came those albums are great as well, but this one definitely the standout of the 3. The only like real note I had before we kind of get into some of these songs is I don't understand why There is the opening track. I know some people love that it's the opening track, but for me, it just kind of like lulls you into the album. It's got a quiet start, and it's it's a fine song, but for me, it feels weird to be the opener. But what were some of I guess kind of your initial thoughts or quick thoughts on the record before we jump into a few songs?
Yeah, I mean, this one definitely has I thought that same with that opening track. I was like, okay, this isn't winning me over immediately. But it picks up pretty quick. But yeah, overall, the album has a really good energy to it. It's definitely more on the punk side of things than No Closer to Heaven, and I think some of the albums that followed that. So I enjoyed that. It's high energy. Yeah, for some reason, I think kind of what we were talking about before with maybe just the sad boy thing. I've never put that to this, why maybe I don't like it, but kind of after you've mentioned that, maybe just even the lyrical content just kind of never struck a chord with me, which is maybe one reason why I had never really just sat down and listened to a whole album of this. It reminded me of, at times, not musically or really anything, of actually the Weaker Thans. They were another band that just, there was something about the lyrics and the way he sung it that just kind of threw me off. And
you're gonna hurt a lot of people.
I'm not saying I don't like it. There's a few of their albums because I listened to a lot of that on tour because a few of the other guys really liked it. So I'm not saying I don't like it, but there was just something about it that was just a little bit different for me, and it always kind of was like, I don't like. I really can't just grab onto this. Just the way, I guess, the kind of the story that was being told just didn't resonate with me. It didn't have anything against it.
It's really interesting because John K. Sampson, the lead singer and songwriter for the Weaker Thans, he's often looked, and I know that Dan Campbell is a big fan of John K. Sampson and his lyricism, and I know he's looked at as being, like one of the greats, even maybe, whether in like that kind of genre, subgenre, or whatever, like the punk world, or even just one of the greats of his generation when people kind of discover, I'm talking about John K. Sampson, but his lyrics are something that actually, and it's, I'm glad you brought it up because that is one of the things that really draws me into the Wonder Years, is that that particular style of lyricism, right? Like, he's very like John K. Samson. I'm kind of jumping back and forth here, but John K. Samson is very much like he will write in a place where, you know, he will be referencing, I mean, if you're from Winnipeg, in the Winnipeg area, you're probably going to understand a lot of references that he brought up over the years or what have you. But there's like a lot of things where, much in a similar way that this is getting uber Canadian, but Gord Downie of the Tragically Hip would write. Like, Gord Downie, it took me forever to see like, oh, this guy is actually an incredible lyricist. Musically, I couldn't always get into the Tragically Hip. Some of their songs I absolutely love. Some of their songs I'm like, eh. But his lyrics were always so just like, whether he's painting a picture or telling a story or teaching you even. And so like, it's just interesting to see kind of, you know, like going down the line. Cause I would be comfortable in saying that. In fact, I think I read something or heard something that John K. Samson learned from Gord Downie was that it's okay to write about where you're from. Right? Like, and then in a similar way, Dan Campbell has been influenced by John K. Samson, maybe not just John K. Samson, but to write where he's from or about where he's from, which, not knowing, you know, he writes a lot about, if I understand, about Chicago and Philadelphia. They're a Pennsylvania band. And so there is a lot of this stuff going on where I'm like, okay, I don't necessarily understand those references like at all, but the way he tells stories and puts you in places I absolutely love. And that was really what drew me in to the band.
That's funny you mentioned the Tragically Hip, because I mean, I wouldn't consider myself a fan at all or even really know any of their music, but I've heard enough on the radio or whatever.
Yeah.
But there was a few times listening, it might have been No Closer to Heaven, but there was a few times I was like, this guy sounds like the Tragically Hip singer, like maybe just some really small little nuances or the way, but that popped into my head. So it's funny you bring that up, because there was times I don't know if it was the lyrics and the way he was saying it or what it was, but
it's interesting because now I want to go and listen for that, because I could see some sort of similarities in the fact, like, Dan Campbell, he's never been, especially on like the quieter bits, he's never been, or softer parts, he's never been a vocalist where I'm like, oh, he's super, like, he's awesome, right? Like, I love when he gets into kind of his yell and more boisterous kind of stuff. I think, oh, he's great. But some of those quieter, softer parts, I'm like, you know, if that's how he sang most of the time, I don't know. Like, I can't really get into, he has a side project called Aaron West and the Roaring Twenties. And it's definitely a lot different from the Wonder Years. Some of it's more acoustic driven and softer at parts. And I'm like, I can't quite get into it, which is funny because he's still writing the lyrics and still doing a damn good job, but just, like his voice kind of at times, I'm like, I just can't quite get into it. And I've had that same thing with like Gord Downie of the Tragically Hip, right? Like, he's got a unique voice, but that's an intriguing kind of like reference. I'm glad that you kind of, well, I mean, I guess we got there from John K. Samson, but that's incredible. So why don't we get into the three songs that we're going to talk about from this record? You picked two, I picked one. On this one, the first one up is the one I picked. It's the song Dismantling Summer.